January 4th, 1985, a day etched in shadows. Picture this, the noble river, chilly, cold, rushing, flanked by forests so dense they swallow sunlight. Here, a lone figure moves upstream. His name? Boris Weisfeiler. American, 43 years old, Soviet-born, but a man who traded equations for hiking boots. He's jotting notes in a journal, snapping photos of jagged peaks, breathing air so crisp it feels like freedom. But freedom's a fragile thing in 1985 Chile. Because this isn't a postcard, it's a dictatorship. General Pinochet's regime has disappeared over 3,000 people. Dissidents, activists, anyone who asks the wrong questions. Boris? He's just a tourist, a math professor from Penn State chasing adventure. By sunset, he's gone, vanished. No screams, no footprints, just his backpack, abandoned on the riverbank. Inside, a passport, a camera, clothes folded like he planned to return. Chilean police shrug. Drowned. Case closed. But here's the thing, rivers don't fold clothes. They don't hide bodies this well. And Boris Weisfeiler didn't just vanish. He left behind a mystery that would fester for decades. A mystery that leads to whispers of a place not on any map. A place where cult leaders ruled, dictators collaborated, and outsiders, well, outsiders didn't leave. This isn't speculation. It's documented. But to understand how an American academic became a ghost, we need to retrace his last steps and ask the question Chile's government still fears. What happens when you wander too close to the darkness and the darkness decides to keep you? Boris Weisfeiler was nobody's idea of a target. He wasn't chasing scoops or smuggling state secrets. He was a man who found solace in numbers and silence. Born in the Soviet Union in 1941, he fled to America as a teen, a Jewish refugee trading one Cold War for another. By 43, he'd become a respected math professor at Penn State. Colleagues called him brilliant but reserved. Students joked he spoke more to trees than people. Because Boris had an obsession, wilderness. Not just hiking, documenting it. He'd trekked Alaska, Nepal, Patagonia. But Chile's Andes? To him, they were a living equation. Untamed, unpredictable, a puzzle to solve. Friends warned him. Not now, Boris. That country's unstable. But Boris wasn't political. He didn't watch the news. He studied maps. And so, in December 1984, he packed his Nikon, a Russian-English dictionary, and a hiker's naivete. His sister Olga later said, he thought dictators were something in history books. But Chile in 1985 wasn't a history book. It was a slaughterhouse. Pinochet's regime had already disappeared, over 3,000 people. Union leaders, students, teachers. And Boris? He carried a passport stamped USA into a country where that word drew sideways glances. Still, he wrote postcards like a tourist. The rivers here are unlike anything I've seen. He stayed in hostels, chatted with locals, and planned a 4-day trek through the Andes. A quiet man in wireframe glasses, chasing beauty in a land where beauty had gone extinct. But here's what Boris didn't know. In dictatorships, curiosity is a crime. And Chile's secret police, the DINA, had files on everyone, foreigners included. Was Boris taking photos of rivers or something else? To them, it didn't matter. Paranoia poisons logic. And on January 4th, 1985, Boris Weisfeiler walked into a forest and straight into the crosshairs of a regime that made people vanish for sport. Boris's plan was straightforward, or so he thought. 4 days alone in the Andes, a 30-mile loop near the Noble River. December 28, 1984, he checks into a small hostel in Los Lingus. Chile, friendly, unassuming. He tells the owner he's there to hike and study the terrain. January 2nd, he buys bread, canned fish, and matches from a local store. The clerk remembers him smiling. Tourists don't come here, she'd later say. Not anymore. January 3rd, Boris hitches a ride to the river with a farmer. He sets up camp near a remote spot called El Alfalfa. Locals spot his tent and warn him. Leave. Now. No explanation. Just fear in their eyes. But Boris stays. He scribbles in his journal, takes one last photo of the sunset. Then nothing. January 6th, a search party finds his campsite. The tent's intact. His passport sits neatly on his sleeping bag. Clothes folded like gifts at a funeral. No mud. No blood. No signs of a bear or a fall. Just stillness. Chilean officials declare he drowned. Case closed. But here's what they ignore. Drowning victims don't fold their passports. They don't leave cameras dry on riverbanks. And they don't vanish without a single scream. So what really happened between that last photo and the empty tent? Was it bad luck? Or did Boris Weisfeiler walk into a nightmare someone wanted to hide? 15 years after Boris vanished, a stack of declassified CIA documents hit the public eye. Page after page, they revealed a nightmare hiding in plain sight. Nestled deep in Chile's forests, 200 miles south of Santiago, was a place straight out of a horror film, Colonia Dignidad. To the outside world, it was a utopian German colony, a peaceful commune for devout Christians, a place where men in lederhosen farmed, children sang hymns, and everyone smiled. But behind its walls, barbed wire, guard towers, underground bunkers. Survivors called it a Nazi Disneyland, a cult, a prison, and a killing floor all in one. The mastermind? Paul Schaefer, a former Nazi medic turned preacher, a man with a taste for control and little boys. In 1961, he fled Germany to avoid child abuse charges. He brought 300 followers with him, brainwashed, beaten into obedience. They built Colonia Dignidad in Chile's wilderness. Far from prying eyes, Schaefer's rules were simple: no contact with the outside world, no marriages, no families. Children were ripped from parents and re-educated. Dissenters were drugged, tortured, or buried alive. But Pinochet's regime didn't shut it down. They partnered with it. By the 1970s, Colonia Dignidad became a torture hub for the dictatorship. Political prisoners were dragged there, electroshocked, drowned in sewage pits, dissolved in acid vats. Schaefer even gifted Pinochet a private torture chamber. In return, the regime let the cult operate untouchable. And the CIA? They knew. Oh, they knew. Declassified cables from 1968 call Schaefer a dangerous pedophile. Others note the colony's suspicious armed patrols. But the US said nothing. Why? Cold War politics. Pinochet was an anti-communist ally. Colonia Dignidad? Collateral damage. Now, let's circle back to Boris. His campsite near the Noble River? 20 miles from Colonia Dignidad's gates. 20 miles. A distance any jeep could cover in 30 minutes. And here's what survivors testified. The cult's guards patrolled far beyond their borders. Hikers, journalists, lost tourists if you saw too much. You were taken. In 2000, the US State Department finally admitted the unthinkable. Credible evidence indicates Weisfeiler was detained by Chilean patrolmen and taken to Colonia Dignidad. But how? A math professor snapping river photos. What threat was he? Two theories: mistaken identity, Boris spoke Russian. Chile's regime was obsessed with rooting out communist spies. Did they think this Soviet-born hiker was a threat? He saw something. Maybe Boris stumbled onto a cult patrol, or a mass grave, or a secret meeting between Schaefer and Pinochet's men. But here's the darkest twist. The CIA had a source inside Colonia Dignidad. A 1985 memo references an informant's claim. A foreigner matching Weisfeiler's description was held here. But the US didn't rescue him. They didn't even tell his family. Survivors of the colony fill in the gaps. They describe a prisoner barracks for outsiders. Victims were given numbers, not names, forced to work 18-hour days. Some were used as lab rats for Schaefer's medical experiments. Others disappeared after learning too much. One man, now in his 60s, recalls a night in 1985. We heard screams in German, a voice yelling in broken Spanish. "I'm American. Let me go." Could that have been Boris? We'll never know. The colony's records were burned. Mass graves nearby, sealed by the government. Paul Schaefer fled Chile in 1997. He was caught in Argentina, jailed, and died in prison. He took Boris's fate and the fate of hundreds to his grave. But the scars remain. In 2013, Chilean authorities raided the colony. They found 30 tons of hidden weapons, gas grenades, secret tunnels, and a cemetery with unmarked graves. Yet Boris's name appears nowhere. So why does this matter? Because Colonia Dignidad wasn't just a cult. It was a microcosm of evil, a partnership between a psychopath, a dictator, and global powers who looked the other way. Boris Weisfeiler wasn't swallowed by a river. He was swallowed by a system. And the most haunting question isn't how he died. It's how many others died with him, and how many enablers still walk free. Imagine a secret buried so deep, Even the dirt has secrets. For 15 years, Boris Weisfeiler's case gathered dust. A missing tourist, a closed file. Then, in 2000, the US State Department dropped a bombshell, a single line in a declassified memo. Credible evidence indicates Weisfeiler was detained by Chilean agents and taken to Colonia Dignidad. Let that sink in. Detained, not drowned, not lost, detained by agents of a dictatorship. But why? How does a math professor on vacation end up in the clutches of a Nazi cult? The answer lies in a web of lies and the whispers of those brave enough to speak. The memo didn't come from nowhere. Boris's sister, Olga, had spent years badgering US officials, writing letters, filing FOIA requests, digging through redacted files. And finally, she found it, a 1985 CIA cable-marked secret. In it, a Chilean informant claims military officers arrested a foreign hiker near the Noble River. No name, but the date, January 4th, 1985, Boris's last day. So why him? Two theories emerge. One, mistaken identity. Boris was born in the Soviet Union. He spoke Russian, to Pinochet's regime. Still paranoid about communist spies. A Russian-speaking hiker taking photos near a secret torture colony? Red flags everywhere. Two, he saw too much. Colonia Dignidad's guards patrolled miles beyond their borders. If Boris stumbled onto a mass grave, a weapons convoy, or a cult patrol, he became a liability. But the most chilling clues come from survivors. In 2003, a former Colonia Dignidad mechanic testified. In 1985, we had a foreigner in the prison barracks. He kept yelling he was American. They called him El Russo, the Russian. Another survivor, a cook, recalled Schaefer ranting about a spy in the mountains who needed to be silenced. Then there's the electric fence. In 1985, Colonia Dignidad's perimeter was lined with wires rigged to stun trespassers. A farmer living nearby told investigators. That January, I heard shouts near the fence, a man begging in broken Spanish. 2 days later, cult guards burned piles of clothing in the forest. Boris's clothes were never found, but the US government's response? Silence. Even after the 2000 memo, they refused to declassify key documents. Why? Because Colonia Dignidad wasn't just Chile's shame, it was ours. Declassified files proved the CIA had an informant inside the colony as early as 1968. They knew about the torture, the child abuse, the weapons stockpiles, but in the name of Cold War alliances, they turned a blind eye. In 2012, another bombshell, a retired DINA agent confessed on his deathbed. We picked up an American near the river. He said, Schaefer's men took him. I didn't ask questions. When pressed about Boris, he shrugged. Nobody leaves Colonia alive. But the darkest truth? Paul Schaefer knew, when investigators finally cornered him in 2005 in a Chilean prison, where he'd been jailed for child abuse. He smirked. I don't recall any American, he said. Then he added, chillingly, but the river has many ghosts. Schaefer died in 2010. The truth died with him. Meanwhile, Olga Weisfeiler kept fighting. She tracked down Colonia Dignidad's victims, sifted through survivor sketches of the prison barracks. One drawing, from 2005, shows a gaunt man in glasses scribbling numbers on a cell wall. Olga swears it's Boris. He'd do math to stay sane, she said, but without a body, without a confession. The case remains open. Chile's government has lost key files. US officials cite national security. And the few survivors still alive? They're tired. One told Olga, the dead don't speak here. They scream. So why does this matter? Because Boris wasn't just taken. He was erased. By a cult. By a dictatorship. By governments who chose geopolitics over a single human life. His story forces us to ask, how many more Boris Weisfeilers are buried in classified files? And how long do secrets get to outlive the truth? Most missing persons cases fade. Families grieve. Files yellow. But Boris Weisfeiler's story? It refuses to die. Because his sister, Olga, wouldn't let it. For 40 years, she's been a one-woman army, fighting dictatorships, cults, and her own government to find her brother. It started with a phone call. January 1985. Chilean officials told Olga, Boris drowned. Stop asking. But Olga knew her brother. He'd survived Siberian winters. He didn't drown in a river. So she flew to Chile, knocked on doors. bribed cops, followed whispers into slums where even police feared to go. In 1991, a break. A farmer confessed to seeing Boris surrounded by armed men near Colonia Dignidad. They wore uniforms. He said, not army, cult uniforms. But when Olga demanded an investigation, the farmer disappeared. Undeterred, she tracked down Colonia Dignidad survivors. Many were too traumatized to speak. Others risked death to talk. One woman, Maria, met Olga in secret. In 1985, they brought a foreigner to the medical lab. He had glasses, looked educated. They tested drugs on him. Then he vanished. Maria drew Olga a map of the colony's underground tunnels. Look here, she said. They burn bodies there. Olga took that map to Chilean judges. They shrugged. No proof. She petitioned the US Senate. They sent thoughts and prayers. So she did the unthinkable. In 2005, she confronted Paul Schaefer in his prison cell. The cult leader, frail and handcuffed, smirked when she said Boris's name. Never heard of him, he hissed. Olga slapped photos of Boris on the table. Look at him. Look at what you did. Schaefer leaned closer. The river takes many things. Frau Weisfeiler, even memories. But Olga didn't break. She joined forensic teams digging through mass graves near Colonia Dignidad. She sifted dirt stained with bone fragments, tested DNA, pleaded with Chilean officials to compare samples to Boris's dental records. They lost the records. In 2016, hope flickered again. A cache of secret police files surfaced. One memo detailed a foreign hiker held at Colonia Dignidad in January 1985. The file ended mid-sentence. The next page? Missing. Meanwhile, survivors still hear echoes. Juan, a former colony electrician, told Olga, at night, the bunkers they screamed. Men, women, sometimes in languages I didn't know. Another survivor, Helga, woke for years to nightmares of a voice shouting, why Americanettes? I'm an American, in Russian. But evidence isn't the problem. Will is. Chile's government still protects Pinochet's allies. In 2020, a judge ordered Colonia Dignidad's underground labs excavated. The military blocked access. National security risk. When Olga demanded the US pressure Chile, a State Department official sighed. It's been 40 years. Let it go. Let it go. Boris's case isn't about closure. It's about complicity. The CIA knew about Colonia Dignidad's torture chambers in the 1970s. They called it disturbing and did nothing. Declassified files prove US diplomats visited the colony in 1968. They ate strudel with Schaefer, praised his clean, efficient operation. Today, the colony's land is a memorial park. Tourists picnic where children were raped, where dissidents were melted in acid, where Boris Weisfeiler might have taken his last breath. Olga's now in her 80s. Her hands shake, her voice cracks, but she still writes letters, still files lawsuits, still stands at the edge of mass graves, staring at the dirt. He's here, she tells reporters. I feel it. Why won't this case die? Because it's not just Boris. It's the thousands swallowed by Colonia Dignidad, the ones whose names we'll never know, the ones buried under lies stamped classified. Dictators die, cult leaders rot. But Olga? She outlasted them all. Not with guns or money, with a question she's asked every day for 40 years. Where is my brother? And somewhere, in the silence of Chile's forests, the truth still screams, leaves Olga's fight unresolved, mirroring the case's real-life limbo. Powerful people wanted him gone. Let's cut through the lies. Boris Weisfeiler didn't just vanish, he was erased. And he was erased because powerful people wanted him gone. Not because he mattered, because he didn't. Rewind to 1985. Ronald Reagan's White House called Pinochet's Chile a beacon of democracy. Never mind the death squads, the mass graves. The US sent the regime billions in aid, guns, and political cover. Why? Cold War math. Pinochet hated communists. Therefore, he was our monster. But here's what they knew. Declassified CIA cables from 1984, months before Boris's disappearance, warned about Colonia Dignidad. One report states, Schaefer's colony operates as a clandestine torture center with full support of Chilean military. Another memo, stamped eyes only, admits US diplomats have observed armed patrols near colony grounds. They knew. So when Boris went missing, what did the US do? Nothing. Worse than nothing. When Olga begged the State Department for help in 1985, they stonewalled her. A diplomat wrote in a memo, pressing Chile on this could damage relations. Advise family to accept drowning theory. Let me repeat that. Damage relations. A man's life weighed against. What? Arms deals? Trade agreements? This wasn't negligence. It was policy. And Boris wasn't alone. Declassified files proved the US shielded thousands of Pinochet's crimes. Why? Henry Kissinger himself put it bluntly in 1976. We can't let human rights protests undermine a strategic ally. Translation. Some deaths are convenient, but Boris's case cuts deeper. Because Colonia Dignidad wasn't just a Chilean horror. It was a joint operation. The cult's doctors experimented on prisoners with drugs supplied by US pharmaceutical companies. Their weapons? Often stamped, made in USA. Their torture techniques? Taught by CIA manuals from the School of the Americas. So when Boris screamed, "I'm an American," in those bunkers, nobody came, not because they couldn't hear him, because they'd already chosen not to listen. And the cover-up didn't end in 1985. In 2000, when the State Department finally admitted Boris was taken to Colonia Dignidad, they buried the lead. A key sentence in their report reads, "We have no evidence of US involvement." Of course they didn't. They made sure not to look. But Olga did. She found a 1986 letter from a US embassy worker in Chile. It reads, "Local sources confirm Weisfeiler was interrogated at Colonia Dignidad. Request guidance." The response from Washington? A single line. "No further action required." Let that sink in. No further action. A US citizen tortured on foreign soil. A soil soaked in American tax dollars, and they shrugged. This isn't conspiracy. It's arithmetic. Dictatorships need three things to thrive: monsters like Pinochet and Schaefer, money like US aid, silence like redacted files and empty promises. Boris Weisfeiler was collateral damage in a war he didn't know existed. A war where democracy was sacrificed for stability, where human lives were currency. And the worst part, it's still happening. In 2022, the US declassified another batch of files on Colonia Dignidad. Half the pages were blacked out. Olga, now 82, told reporters, "They're still protecting someone. But who's left to protect? The dead." The answer? Yes, because the dead don't just bury secrets. They bury shame. So why does this matter? Because Boris's story isn't history, it's a mirror. How many strategic allies do we back today while ignoring their graves? How many Boris Weisfeilers are vanishing right now, as we look away? Archives are supposed to be tombs for the truth. Shelves of dust and ink where facts rest in peace. But Boris Weisfeiler's file? It's haunted. A ghost story stamped classified. Officially. He's still missing. No grave. No justice. Just a paper trail of lies so redacted. Even the lies have secrets. 40 years later, his passport sits in a CIA vault. His journal gathers mold in a Chilean evidence locker. And his sister Olga? She keeps a shoebox of letters, denials from politicians, empty apologies from diplomats. "We regret to inform you, no further action, national security." But this isn't just about Boris anymore. It's about the machine that vanished him. A machine built by three hands: the cult, Colonia Dignidad's barbed wire greed; the dictatorship, Pinochet's hunger for silence; the superpower, America's cold, convenient blindness. Together, they turned a human being into a footnote, a man who loved math and mountains reduced to a memo, a rumor, a case number. Because when systems decide you're invisible, they don't need to kill you. They just need everyone to stop saying your name. But Olga won't stop. She's 82 now. Her hands shake as she files another FOIA request, another lawsuit, another plea to dig up Colonia Dignidad's soil. Why? Because Boris isn't the only ghost. That colony's land is a quilt of unmarked graves. Thousands of them. Dissidents. Children. People whose crimes were simply existing near the darkness. And the darkness is still here. In Chile, Colonia Dignidad's enablers now sit in Congress. In Washington, the CIA still blacks out documents with excuses older than Boris himself. Sources and methods. Ongoing operations. Meanwhile, the truth rots. But let's be clear, this isn't history. It's a blueprint. Today, autocrats still build factories of silence. Cults still hide behind religion and rhetoric. And superpowers? They still pick allies over lives. The names change. The playbook doesn't. So I'll ask you this. When Boris walked into those Chilean woods in 1985, he left a trail, notes, Photos, footprints, all erased. You're leaving a trail right now. Emails, location pins, search history. Who gets to decide if that trail disappears? Maybe it's a government, maybe a tech giant, maybe a conspiracy in some forest compound. The question isn't could you vanish? It's who would care. Boris's story isn't a warning. It's a mirror. We make invisible what we fear, what we don't understand, what's inconvenient. Refugees, activists, the poor, the different. But here's the thing about ghosts. They don't rest until someone bears witness. Until someone says, I see you, so look closer at those redacted files. Listen to the gaps in official statements. Hear Olga's voice cracking after 40 years of no. Because the silence isn't empty. It's screaming. Boris Weisfeiler is gone. But we're still here. And as long as we keep asking why, as long as we refuse to let the machine grind his name to dust, he isn't missing. He's evidence. In 2024, Boris Weisfeiler's case remains open. His sister Olga still waits for answers.